We have talked about the turbid kappa, and last time where we left off was about the wrong view, the turbidity of wrong views, and now we will talk about turbidity of afflictions. Okay. We kind of covered the very top level of turbidity of afflictions, and essentially, this word is increasingly, with more afflictions, right? Provoked by anger, greed, delusions, due to our selfishness, due to our possessiveness, materialism, particularly materialism. If you look at the word, it's very disturbing, right? How the world is turning out to everybody seems to be very protective, and we're building up these walls around ourselves, and we're not communicating. It can easily lead to misunderstanding and conflicts. And so while we're in this world, we have that responsibility to communicate about tolerance, about acceptance and collaboration. And it is part of our responsibility, and we don't learn about Buddhism to practice cultivating meditative bliss for ourselves, but to empower ourselves and not get lost in the meditative bliss, right? Meditative bliss is just a secondary effect. It's not the primary reason why we study Buddhism, but to empower ourselves so that we can knock down the walls around ourselves of selfishness, so that we can communicate and we can collaborate with other people. It means that we need to be wiser because people have different expectations. And if we don't know how to deal with people, it can easily lead to afflictions, a lot of worries, anxiety, anxiety of what's going to happen in the next election, the US elections, right? What's going to happen and so forth. We can ask all those questions all day long, and if we don't know how to control ourselves, then it can easily lead to affliction. And that's why I think today's topic is particularly important and relevant in today's environment. We want to know where affliction comes from, the sources of afflictions, and what to do with affliction, and how to transcend the affliction from affliction itself to nirvana. So I think today's topic is particularly relevant in today's environment. I took this from a book on Milarepa's experience when he was cultivating in the mountains in an isolated, desolated environment under the instruction of his teacher. So his teacher told him to go up in the mountains all by himself to practice meditation and to gain enlightenment. And so he did. And he was able to enter very deep meditation. And he was in meditation for a long period of time where he consumed all the foods around him. So finally he felt hungry. So he wanted to venture off outside of his cave to look for food. And I believe during this time he was so weak, and he had only a piece of rope on him. He was practically naked, but he had a little small rope, and he was trying to wash it, and he was hanging it on. And there was a storm coming, and he was so weak that he couldn't fight the storm to keep the rope, piece of cloth with him. So the wind took it away, and the wind blew him over. He fell to the ground. And just right before he went unconscious, he saw his ego. He saw how he was clinging on essentially it's this worthless piece of rope that he was fighting to possess. He was fighting the wind to take it back. And he realized how pitiful it was that this piece of worthless piece of cloth that he was fighting because he thought that he needed. So that was when he realized that he was clinging on to his ego ever more tightly. He thought that he had entered very deep meditation. He was able to overcome a lot of spiritual obstacles, hindrances, but yet he was not able to overcome his ego. But only through deep meditation that he was able to detect that he was still clinging onto his ego, right? Because he felt that he needed that piece of cloth. He needed it in order to shelter himself, to care for this body. And when he recognized that this as evidence of a still active ego, that he gave up his robe and just say, win, take it all, take whatever you want. And then he just fell to the ground. And so this taught him that the ego is very deep, and the ego is the foundation, is the fertile ground for afflictions to grow. Because of ego, that we think we need this, we need that, and because of that we cause rise to anger, greed, and delusion, just for things that we need. And so where does this affliction come from? Well, it comes from a sense consciousness. So we differentiated last time between consciousness and wisdom. Consciousness is the ability to recognize things around you through your physical senses with your attention and the mental object. They come together with your attention, you cause rise to sense consciousness. Whereas wisdom is the purified version of it, is the more pure knowing, right? So that's a differentiation between consciousness and wisdom. And consciousness, this is particularly, this was mentioned in the Sitapatthana Sutra, and it talks about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And it is the recollections of these mental objects with the 6 sense bases, right? Our eyes, ears, hearing, sensing and touch and so forth. Those 6 sense bases and the objects that together with your attention to it, that you have this consciousness, so sense-based consciousness. So maintaining a continuous awareness as objects impinge upon consciousness, we will recognize the unhealthy mental states that we are under influence of. And they are hindrances because they affect our moods without our knowing sometimes. And they cause rise to lust, ill will, sloth, torpor, restlessness, anxiety, and doubt. Right? So those things that we see without our awareness will make us become afflicted mentally. And they cloud our clarity of perception. We become biased. We see things, we think that it's the truth because, hey, I see it with my own eyes, but yet it's not the truth. For example, you put a pencil in water, right? We've done this in our elementary school science activity. You put a pencil in water because of the light refraction, you see is bent, that is bent. Your eyes is telling you it's bent, but you know it's not bent. So you cannot say that what you see is the truth. And even what you hear is the truth because it goes into your senses and you interpret based on your delusion, based on your wrongful perception. So these deep-seated states of mind form the very fabric of our self-view, our sense of who we are and the world around us. So that's why we don't see eye to eye, so to speak, because we have this veiled on in front of us that we cannot see through, and that view is the misconception of reality. These mental states are very difficult to detect because it requires meditation in order to detect it. Because if you move with it, just like 2 objects moving together, you are really constant relative to each other. You cannot see itself moving. Just like when you're on a train, right? You don't see the train moving because you're on the train, moving at the same speed as the train. So when we are deluded and we have this bias in us, we are moving along with afflictions. and therefore we cannot detect our affliction. It requires meditation to detect, hey, this is not healthy. This is affliction. So Milarepa was able to sustain awareness through his meditation, and he was able to detect the arising of the ego, his ego. And he was able to detect the fetter of self-view, that he was a fixed, a separate entity. And even as he was grasping desperately at the few remaining possessions, his rope and his few sticks of firewood, he was trying to make some food. And so this worthless piece of cloth, anybody would see and say, why would I want this rag? But to him, it was very precious, because it was what he needed to keep himself warm, I suppose, right? So at that moment, to him, his possessions were everything. Even the few sticks of firewood, he needed those as well. And though because of his meditative mind, through his practice, that he was able to detect this is unhealthy desire. Of course, I mean, from his perspective, but from our perspective, it's very high up there. We need our clothes. We just can't go naked. It's not proper. But to him, he has surpassed the shame feeling, the normal shame feeling. And the shame here he described in his book as not somebody who is not well clothed, I should feel ashamed of himself. But shame here, in his definition, is a person who does not know that he's committing unskillful deeds. To him, that is shameful. Not because you are not well clothed that you should be shameful, but one's shame should come from the fact that one does not have awareness that one is committing unskillful deeds. Okay. So for him to say that, to admonish himself that he was still attached to his clothes and his firewoods, those things are necessary. But sometimes we trick ourselves by saying, this is what I need. Rightly so, this is what you need. But sometimes we fool ourselves and we trick ourselves, and then we need more and more and more just to compensate for what you have. Right? You have, like, say, a car. Well, you need a car, but then the car comes with insurance, right? It comes with maintenance. It comes with a lot of things. So once you have something, you continue to have to keep up with it. And that's the problem. The problem is not having a car. The problem is all the expenses, all the things that are required. Now we have a car, it's well maintained, but I don't like my car anymore. It's 2 years old. It's old. It's not the modern style anymore, right? So that's the problem. That's what the problem is, right? So we should be mindful that once we have something, it's easy to forget to appreciate what we have and to look for something else, right? To look for something more modern, so it's more beautiful, right? So Milarepa's mindfulness consists in seeing how and when the senses come into contact with the objects. And any one of these hindrances may arise. So he knows that by being attached, by having this possessiveness, it is a hindrance to spiritual growth. So once we are able to refine consciousness to the extent that we can be aware of these subtle mental comings and goings, we then have only to understand deeply enough the significance of what we see to take the appropriate action. It's not enough just to be aware that I have anger, I have an anger problem, or it's not enough to say, yeah, I have weaknesses. Well, we should do something about those things, right? So one thing is to recognize our weaknesses. The second thing is we have to take actions to do something about it. That's more realistic, because if you only recognize your weaknesses, then you're being passive. And if you're not offering a solution, you're just complaining, right? So we do want to bring those problems up, but at the same time, we need to offer solutions. That's how it works in the office, right? At work, you can't just bring up a problem. Hey, boss, we have this problem. Well, that's great. What are you going to do about it, right? Likely, that's how your boss is going to ask you. You keep doing that without offering any solutions, then it's not a good reflection. Just like if you were your own boss and you have employees working under you, you will feel pretty annoyed if your employee keeps coming to you for problems and not offering any solutions. So we don't want to be that. We want to offer solution as well. We don't want to keep things under the rug, but we want to bring them up and do those things, right? Deal with those things. Now that we know how harmful and how harmful and it is to be egoistically attached and become possessive. Now the next step is, what are we going to do about it, right? So the hindrances do not arise with any great fanfare. They are extremely subtle, and they require a lot of work. So that's what meditation, although we said meditation to have meditative bliss, but there's a lot of work involved. So it's not just sitting there and doing nothing. That's not it. On the outside, it looks like a person just sitting there meditating, doing nothing. But in fact, there's a lot of work behind that, right? He's always, or she is always watchful of herself and not allow the mind to drift away. So that's a lot of work. It's very demanding work. There are things that we can, if we pay enough attention to ourselves, the small things will give them away. The small things will allow us to detect the weaknesses that we have in ourselves to improve. We cannot be expected to be perfect all the time, but we can at least be aware that, hey, I'm still weak. I have a lot of weaknesses. I have a lot of afflictions. Yes, I have an anger problem or whatnot, but that's okay. At least we recognize that we have something to work on, and then we can find ways to work on those things. For example, if you can easily, the small things, like for example, you finish all your duties, and you have a little bit of free time. When in your free time, what do? If you automatically reach for your phone to look on YouTube or look for on the internet, as opposed to maintaining your awareness, then that's your habit, right? It's our habit that will give it away. And so we stop that. We don't allow that to continue. In the book, The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Deutsch, neurologist. In his book, he describes how when we do something, our brain forms a network, neurological network. Especially when we do something that very pleasurable, we tend to continue to do those things. If you sit in meditation and you feel very happy about it, you're likely to want to repeat that activity because you form this neuronal networks in you, and it taps into your reward system, right? Our mind has two reward systems. One is called exciting pleasure. The other one is more like satisfying pleasure. And regardless, if it's pleasurable, we want to continue to repeat. And it goes deeper than that in the sense that you can rewire your brain in such a way that pain becomes pleasure. And you continue to inflict pain on you in order to get that pleasure. So it can get really wild. It can get really, messed up or whatnot. But anyways, as long as you can tap into this pleasure system, you want to continue to repeat that. So that's why we have a tendency to do the things we want to do and becomes a habit. Every time we get a kick from watching a YouTube video or being on the internet or whatever, looking at the contents, we want to continue to repeat that because the brain wants to reward itself. And so it produces this called dopamine, a chemical, a neuronal transmitter that releases the chemical dopamine that's very pleasurable. And it's very exciting. And so it wants you to continue to repeat. But the problem with that is that it depletes your sensitivity, meaning that you will require more. You have to increase the level of dopamine in order to have that satisfaction. The other end is called endorphin. Endorphin is more pleasing, like you just don't want to do anything. It's more very pleasing. It's not as opposed to exciting. It's more pleasing, satisfaction, and it kind of numbs your senses. So that's another bad part. Is numb your senses. It numbs your awareness. You will be slower to respond to any kind of outside environment. But anyways, once you continue to do something, your mind forms a pattern, and you continue to want to repeat that. And the more that you repeat that, you want even more and more, and it depletes your sensitivity, and therefore it consumes your time, it consumes yourself, your energy, trying to feed it anymore. So that's the problem with this reward system. And so those little things that we don't detect, they will become part of us, and they'll take over. They'll take us. No, they'll become not only become a part of us, but they'll take us over. And so it helps when we study and learn about and practice meditation, that we have this awareness that, why am I doing this? See, people get into this habit that they reach for their phone or food or whatever, and they're not aware of what they're doing. They continue to form this network and becomes a habit, and it's very difficult for them to break that habit. So if we always do some things and we have this awareness, why am I doing this? Okay, I have my free time, and instead of being mindful, observing my breath or doing something that's productive, I'm engaging in this like mindless entertainment. Like, why am I doing this? Well, it helps to relieve stress. Okay, that's fine. Then you know, at least you know what you're doing, and then come back to yourself, to your awareness. Right? Don't allow you to continue to mindlessly drift and lose your self-control. So those little small things that will give it away, that we are allowing our weaknesses to grow. Right? So it helps to maintain that awareness. And while we are not perfect, and what we learn of Buddhism, we want to change, but you don't want to change immediately. You don't want to put on the brakes, like when you're traveling like 100 miles an hour on the freeway and try and make a U-turn, go back. You will flip and hurt yourself. And so even though we want to change, but we don't want to hurt ourselves. So it helps to gradually change and not going through abrupt change. And so once we know our way and our weaknesses, and we kind of delayer our weaknesses one at a time, and we do what we need to do to adjust our attitude, to bring it more into line of our goal and our aspiration, right? Okay, so that's why the Buddha, at the end of his life, his last words were, "With mindfulness, strive." Right? It's always encouraging us to maintain awareness. Why am I doing this? Is it in line with my goal, my aspiration? Right? And that helps to avoid distractions as well. Right? So know what is it that you're doing. Take note of every detail of your experience. If you notice of any unskillful deeds or any unhealthy attachment, then take immediate action to change. And this is less complicated than it sounds, because even though it sounds very demanding, but if we take one step at a time, it's not that bad, right? It's just that we have to recognize, I want to change. And the car's still rolling, it's still driving 100 miles an hour, but at least I can tap on the brake slowly and reduce the speed, as opposed to slam on the brakes and try to stop the car from moving. That's dangerous. Just to summarize what we just talked about, we have our sense basis, right? Our physical senses, plus the sense objects. If we have delusion, then it forms sense consciousness, and that leads to affliction. Whereas we still utilize our physical senses, and we still interact with the world. We can still hear, we can still see, we can still smell, still have contact. But with mindfulness, it leads to transcendental awareness. Does it make sense? Right, so one leads to affliction, the other one leads to transcendental awareness. And the difference is between delusion and mindfulness. So mindfulness is very powerful. It allows you to correct yourself, because when we have this awareness, we are preventing that neuronal network from growing, from gaining strength. Once we have awareness, we weaken it and we can form new networks, healthier networks. And those healthy networks becomes our good habits, and it'll be easier for us to make progress. Does it make sense? Right? And it's easy for us to overcome because delusion has no origin and can be transcended. There's a story in the White Lotus Sutra of a parable of a hidden jewel. A person went to his friend. He ate too much and drank too much, and he got tired and he fell asleep. And then his friend inserted a jewel in his cloak and went away on to attend his business. And when the friend woke up, he realized that his friend was gone, so he left too. Years later, the friend met up with him, saw him, and he was still a poor man. He was poor when he came to his friend's house, and then he was still poor when his friend met him. And so his friend admonished him, saying, "Why are you so poor? Don't you realize that I inserted a jewel, I sewn a jewel in your cloth, in your cloak, that you can use that jewel, sell it, exchange it for money? Why are you so pitifully accepting scraps of food from other people and be happy? You should be happy with riches, not scraps of food." Right? So the parable here illustrates that there is a state of spiritual unawareness or ignorance represented by this person, this drunk state, right? Drunkard state. He was drunk, and so therefore he was not aware of what was going on. So that represents a state of spiritual unawareness or ignorance. And that unawareness, that ignorance is because of not having the knowledge of any higher truth. And even without knowing the possibility that that truth can be attained. So that's ignorance. And that leads to a state of profound spiritual alienation. So according to Buddhism, there is no point of ultimate origin of the state of spiritual unawareness. It's not like there was unawareness, ignorance that we always had, not like unlike the original sin, right, from in Christianity. The unawareness that we have does not have origin, and that's why we can overcome it and transform it and transcend it. If it was truly existing, truly with an origin, then there will be no way for us to overcome it, right? So that no such point can be perceived, meaning that we cannot really perceive this delusion. And it's not that we can spend time trying to clean it up, trying to transform it. Although cultivation and attaining Buddhahood requires time for us to transform ourselves, but attaining enlightenment is outside of time. So the delusions that we have, the afflictions that we have, those are all transformable because they have no fixed existence. They are not their own separate entities. And so we cannot base on time to find something that transcends time, to find Buddhahood, meaning you cannot prolong your study, your preparation, and go through a long period of time and then eventually you get to Buddhahood. That's not what it means here. Because if the origin of existence, the origin of ignorance truly exists, then it is a permanent state of existence, right? And so therefore our mundane state can never be transcended. That's why the Buddha is saying here, or that's why our ignorance does not have an origin. Right? And even though ignorance is the natural condition of man, mundane man, but it is not necessarily a permanent one. And transcending here means, I guess we can wake up to it, to the higher truth. And it is the result of following a progressive spiritual path from ethics to concentration to wisdom, to have clear vision. So as long as it is not transcended, even though it's not permanent, but as long as we cannot transcend our state of ignorance, there can be no escape from suffering. Right? Even though it's not real, but that in order to transcend suffering, we have to transcend ignorance. Right? So this state of spiritual alienation is the result of our spiritual unawareness or our ignorance, without knowledge of any higher truth. The higher truth here is the living water that nourishes the very roots of our being and enables us to grow. So in the absence of the truth, our world is a dry, barren place in which, scorched as it is by the heat of passions. Our mind in this world, if we have no awareness of the higher truth, will be burned by afflictions. And our mind here is either being pushed or being pulled by the worldly pursuits. Right? If we have no awareness, we will be pulled or pushed by the world all the time. And we can never settle down. We can never have a moment of peace, never a moment of self-control. You always want to have the latest. Right? If you don't have the latest, it's agonizing. If you don't have, it's suffering. But once you have, it's still suffering because there's fear in losing what you have. So without awareness, you're in between a rock and a hard place. There's no way about it. If you want to isolate yourself, you want to run away from the world, it will pursue you. It will pull you out of that and torture you. So without awareness, no matter where you go, you can never escape. Right? The world that we live in, without awareness, we continue to pursue our inferior goals. But without awareness, and if we dedicate our time, ourselves to inferior goals, it doesn't mean that it's not meaningful, in a sense that those inferior goals will give us experience of no deep, lasting satisfaction. Right? We get tired of those things easily. The good food that you have today, if you continue to eat, then eventually you will lose the satisfaction. Right? The dopamine, the chemicals in our brain, it feels very satisfying, exciting. But if you continue to excite it, stimulate it, then eventually it becomes less satisfying, and you have to add more, you have to increase more. And that's why people become addictive to things that they do, either substance abuse and whatnot, or games, video games and whatnot. They become addictive because they need to increase that dopamine, that chemical in the brain, in order to feel satisfying, and in order to have that satisfying feelings. And that's how the world is that we don't have this deep, lasting satisfaction because it's inferior. The things that we pursue are inferior. Does that make sense? Right? We expend too much labor and effort for food and clothing and great hardships and are content even if we can obtain but little. So in the parable where the poor friend was happy with scraps of food and he had no knowledge, I guess, awareness of the riches. So he was just happy, content of the little that he had, but his friend knew better. His friend knew better that he could be better than this. So same thing too, when we have the things that we pursue, we feel very happy. We think that it is all there is to life without having awareness that there is much more meaningful than what we have. So in the parable, the rich man's drunken friend is poor, remained to be poor, but he had no awareness that he could have riches, right? Better than the scraps of food that he received. So we all have this hidden Jew in us, but we don't have that awareness when we could exchange the hidden Jew for something better. And we don't have to live day by day with fear, not knowing what's going to be tomorrow for us. So worldly people without awareness are drowned in their own afflictions, right? Jealousies, hatred, possessiveness. And sometimes they feel vindicated when they acquire those things. They have hatred and they hurt somebody. And if their enemy is hurt, they feel vindicated, they feel happy. So that happiness is, to Buddhas and Bodhisattva, is so pitiful. Like, you are being happy that your anger is being satisfied from hurting other people. Okay, that is so, what I'm saying, that is so lowly, and that is very pitiful, because you are creating unskillful deeds and you're going to have to face suffering later on. But to them, they felt very satisfied when they could kick the enemy who was down, right? So not knowing the riches of meditative bliss, spiritual liberations, they remain spiritually poor and in suffering. Right? That's how the worldly people are without awareness of the higher truth. The explanation goes on to say that we are living in a wasteland. Now, this samsara is a wasteland to us because it is stricken by famine and slavery and oppression. Right? All the hatreds, all the afflictions around us. And that's why it's a wasteland. And living as a result of our spiritual alienation is a world in which we are foreigners and aliens. We live in this world, we think we belong to this world, but we're not. We are foreigners to this world because we are unaware of our potentiality, unaware that we have this hidden Jew in us. And it is not without knowing that we have in our possessions our ability to become enlightened. So what we have forgotten is priceless. And that priceless thing, and I'm putting air quotes here, it's not a physical thing. It's not like a true mind where there is something permanent. But a true mind here, or something that's very priceless, is the ability and the opportunity to achieve Buddhahood. Meaning that even though you have this opportunity, but if you don't realize the opportunity, then you will never be able to attain it. Right? You have this potentiality, but you still have to put effort to achieve it. Right? So even though it's not like a juice that is always with you and then you don't have to work at it. Even with a jewel is still priceless if you're hungry, because you cannot eat it. So you have to convert that juice into something, food or money, into money, and then money you go buy food or exchange it directly from your juice to food. But there is a process of exchanging, to get food. So the same thing, we have this priceless jewel in us, this opportunity. But if we were to study, to practice, then we will not be able to exchange that Jew for something that we can utilize, that can be of benefits to us, right? We have this knowledge, this whole library of Buddhist texts, but we don't bother to read. We don't bother to do anything about it, then all those books are useless, right? So we are foreigners to our true mind, our ability to achieve enlightenment. And this enlightenment here is really beyond time. And what does it mean to be beyond time or eternity? The ultimate reality is considered as transcending time, rather than as an infinite prolongation of time. So infinity in Buddhism here does not mean that or you live for a long period of time, forever and ever. That's not what eternity here means, but it means it goes beyond time, and also space as well. So we shouldn't take eternity to be we should not take it literally, but we come to understand these terms through meditation, right? Because through meditation that you can transcend time and space. Let's talk a little bit further and what that means. For example, if we look at the Buddha's attainment, in the sutras, it says he traversed 3 great kappas to attain Buddhahood. So we should not misunderstand to think that, if I spend a long time practicing Buddhism, then eventually I'll get to Buddhahood. You're just chugging along and without any kind of awareness, eventually you get there. No, doesn't mean that you don't need to put in the effort and eventually you attain your goal. That's not what it means here. But it is true in a sense of speaking conventionally, that yes, you have to spend time, right? So we're not ignoring the fact that there is an effort that needs to be put in, and when you put in effort to practice, that's over time. But the attainment itself is not time dependent. So although the Buddha as a historical person may have existed within time, but Buddhahood itself exists outside of time. And here again, just because you spend a lot of time reading doesn't mean that you will become smart, right? So it's more than that. A person might not need to read, can become smart, but reading helps to become smart. Does it make sense, right? So in other words, we should not be so attached to reading, but we should ask ourselves, why am I reading? How is this helping me? So when you reflect like that, you are accelerating. It helps you to understand, helps to put things in perspective, and it helps you with awareness. It helps you to understand beyond the books. Does it make sense? Right? It is outside of time because however long that time goes, it never reaches eternity. It doesn't go beyond time. It just goes on and on. You can never get to infinity. No matter how big of a number is, you can never get to infinity because by definition, infinity is unreachable. So in other words, in 1,000,000 years, we will be no nearer to eternity nor to enlightenment than we are now. Well, this isn't all hopeless. We can look the other way around to say that at this very moment, we are as close to enlightenment as we shall ever be. Even bodhisattvas on the verge of enlightenment is no nearer to it than we are right now. Buddhism is very realistic. It's not a promise that you get something later on. We want to achieve liberation. It's not that somebody can pick us up and put us in a liberating state, and then we'll be free. But liberation is your decision. Liberation is how you live your life now and in your attitude, right? Liberation is not something given to you, but you decide to realize it. So liberation starts now and not after death or sometime in the future. Because even though there is no true self, our state of being is not fixed. In the future, we will be a different person, but there is still a connection. If we don't change, we're likely to repeat ourselves, to be in the same situation, the same state of mind, delusion. So until we put in the effort, until we decide that we are going to change for the better, we will not be any better. We are as close to enlightenment as we have ever been. Every moment is the last moment. And beyond the last moment, there is only Buddhahood. So right now, we have a chance to transcend our state of being to achieve enlightenment. But we are holding back because one, maybe the fear of the known, and two is because we have a lot that is obstructing us, and it's very difficult to overcome. And if we can overcome that, then we can achieve Nirvana. Nirvana is not a physical state that we can run and hide. It's not like some heaven, that you can be born into, and then that's Nirvana. Nirvana is a state of being. And that state of being is within your hands. You can decide what state of being you want to have. Nirvana is a very curious word that people often, especially those who are not familiar with Buddhism, they think that, oh, Nirvana is like a heaven. Or, oh, you study Buddhism because you want to get to Nirvana. And then they conclude that, oh, Nirvana must be like some sort of heaven. But that's not what it means. The etymology of the word Nirvana is to blow out, to extinguish our craving, our hatred, our ignorance, according to Pali text. Nirvana is a state of incomparable bliss. And it is incomparable because it's beyond the duality of suffering and joy. You cannot compare it because it's beyond. We can compare it in contrast because, oh, this is happy, therefore this is sad, right? This is prettier, this is uglier. So we can compare and contrast. So, but the fact, this object that we call prettier, if we compare it to even prettier object, then it will lose its luster, it will lose its beauty. So beauty or suffering or joy in this world are relative. But the state of Nirvana is incomparable because it has gone beyond the relativity. Does it make sense? Right? So technically speaking, it is the extinction of all passions and defilements. And it is necessary to realize and understand that Nirvana is neither eternal life nor annihilation or extinction in the materialistic sense. So it's not some sort of a heaven that you live forever, right? Or that you're in annihilation and there's nothing to fear. So those two extreme views that we should avoid. One is existential. One is eternal life. The other one is annihilation. So that's, it's in a sense, Nirvana. Now, Nirvana is sometimes it can describe in a negative sense that it's without this, not having this, not having that, right? Extinguishing of this and that. So sometimes it is described in a very negative term. So there's a question here: is it possible to eradicate all passions without developing insight? The author says that it's not possible, in the sense that you gain bodhi, enlightenment. The attainment of bodhi would still be part of the process of eradicating passions, although your mode of expressing that experience would be limited. Now, the path to nirvana can be both has both a negative aspect and a positive aspect. It is a cessation of something unskillful and increasing of something skillful. So it's not just about eliminating greed, anger, and delusion, but it's also the cultivations of compassion and wisdom, right, on the positive sense. But then why is it that somebody would, here it says that why should they have done that if they had genuine spiritual attainments, like referring to ancient authors who compile polytext to exclusively describe nirvana in terms of something negative? Is this something that's of skillful means? Did they did that for a specific reason? So the author is saying this is a circular argument, because you are assuming that they had some genuine spiritual attainment when perhaps they did not. So in other words, we cannot take the things that we read literally, and we have to bounce off from different sources, and not just to take things for granted because of that person's positions or reputation. But we should take it and digest ourselves and make sure that we have this proper understanding. And one way of having this proper understanding is, one, you can read a lot and listen a lot, but then don't become attached, but kind of bounce off and judge for yourself what is proper. Or this could be a deterioration of the spirit, and they thought just in negative terms. So we don't understand why it was. There seems to be a tendency in Theravada or Hinayana to describe nirvana exclusively in terms of negative terms. It could be historical reasons, social or cultural conditioning that somehow, made them to think that way. But there is a positive aspect to the path to nirvana, and it's called the 12 positive nidanas, as opposed to just the negative aspect of the conditionality. There is the positive aspect of conditionality. So those 12 are faith, because of dukkha, that leads to faith, and because of faith, that leads to joy, and then joy leads to rapture, and then calmness. Rapture leads to calmness, calmness leads to bliss, and it leads to intense concentration, that leads to knowledge and vision, disgust with worldly life, without mental afflictions, and then spiritual freedom, and knowledge of the fact of decay, and eventually wisdom leading to extinction of the contaminants. So I'll go into the details just a little bit, but those are more on the positive aspect of it. The more that we practice Buddhism, the more that we incorporate Buddhism in our daily lives, we should feel more and more positive and inspiring, right? And not the negative aspect of it. So although they both start, I guess, with dukkha, you gotta have some input. You gotta start somewhere. And on the negative and the positive, they all start with the reasons why they're pursuing something higher. And for that is dukkha, is dissatisfaction. This corresponds to feeling, because we feel dissatisfied. That's why we want something more meaningful, something better, something more reliable. If we don't understand this and we respond in a negative way and we allow afflictions to arise, hatred, anger, delusion, then we are wrapping ourselves up and we are defining our future state, right? We become once again caught up in this wheel of life and death that continues to revolve. But in the process of interacting with the world, we refuse to react unskillfully, and instead, with a healthy mental attitude, then we can break that bond. And so the point here is that we always have a choice in our interaction with the world. We have a choice to either continue to push that wheel of life and death or to stop it. We always have that choice. Every instant of our lives, we always have that choice to make. So a total annihilation of craving with a consequent instantaneous realization of nirvana is possible, or to continue to be stuck in that wheel of cycle of the wheel of life and death. So that's why enlightenment is independent of time. It's at that moment that we decide, I'm going to stop this cycle, this revolution, then you can step out of it. But if you don't, then you continue to push it, right? Of course, this is easier said than done. We can't just stop right away. Like we mentioned earlier, you can't just stop a train traveling 100 miles an hour because you will derail it. Right? You don't want to do that. You'll hurt yourself. So what we want to do is to have this smooth and gradual application of brakes, that transition, so that this way you can control the change. So one extreme is to want to stop, press on the brakes, slam on the brakes, so you can try to stop this immediately. The other extreme is to not press the brakes at all for fear of change. Right? So those two extremes we should avoid. Of course, the middle pathway is to slowly tap on the brakes to slow down and reduce the speed. This is probably a reason why it's very difficult for people to not have attachment. For example, if there is a break off from a long-term relationship, for example, or a death of a loved one, it is very difficult for people to move on. And according to the book, The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Deutsch, so a person who has had a long-term relationship, for example, with a spouse, and throughout decades of happiness, the brain has established neuronal networks in the brain. And so the networks have been set up that way. And when there is a sudden death of a loved one, a spouse, then that person will have to move on, but that person is resisting. Because that person does not want to accept the fact that that person, the loved one, is gone, and that he or she would have to move on. But by moving on, he will have to forget about his loved ones. He will have to delete, right, from his memory of his loved one. And essentially, that is what it's doing in our brains. When we have established a network, for us to unlearn it, to forget about it, we have to break down the network and establish a new one. So in the case of our brains, we have millions of connections in our brain, neuronal connections, that have established over the years. And if we want to forget about that experience, we will have to disconnect billions of network nodes one by one and reestablish them. And that's why it's so painful for people to move on, because they have to unlearn that experience, the wonderful experience. So that's another side effect to this world, is that you have 100 years of happiness, But at the moment, somebody would have to leave. If you are the unfortunate one, you'll be the last one to leave, and you have to adjust yourself how to live without the happiness now, how to rewire your brain in such a way to adapt to the new situation, right? And for some people, telling them to immediately move on from the past is just too painful, and they cannot do it. So it's a gradual transition. The daily practice will make it easier for us to change, to progress, right? So even though we aspire to achieve enlightenment, but we cannot ignore life. We still have a life to live. And therefore, we have to make that transition slowly. And consciously, we have to have awareness that we want to change. And slowly, we will gain that confidence. But it does require first for us to tell ourselves that we want to change. That is very important. We should not ignore that. If we can tell ourselves that, yes, I want to change, then slowly we are rewiring our the neurons in our brains to form new networks. Right now we are overcoming the bad habits. We are unlearning. It's really called, in the book, it's called unlearning your experience and to form a new network for new experience. Every time you do something, you are either reinforcing your habit, your current pattern, the current networks, or you're establishing new ones. They did tons of research, and this is called the brain plasticity, meaning it can adapt. Before, scientists believed that once you grow up, you are the way you are, you cannot change it. For example, they say that if you lost a function due to a stroke of your body, the function of your body, that's it, you cannot recover. But they found out that it is possible for you to recover. A person who has a stroke can still recover, can still talk, can still walk, climb as before. Before, scientists believe that once you have stroke and you've gone through several weeks of therapy and you have not shown any improvement, that's it. You have to accept your situation. That's the way you are for the rest of your life. But neurologists have discovered of this plasticity in the brain that can replace your current function with other parts of the brain. Meaning that the function that, for example, the primary function of your motor cortex controls movement. It resides in a certain location, but it can transfer to another location of brain to take on that function, to do something else. But it requires for us to train ourselves. Like a person who has a stroke and he's half paralyzed, it is possible for him to, because that part of the brain, like if you're paralyzed on the left-hand side, then your right-hand side of the brain is damaged. Now, that function will have to transfer from the right-hand side of your brain to the left-hand side of the brain, but it takes effort. You have to convince yourself that you can do it, one, right? And two is you have to put in the effort. And three is that you continue to exercise the right-hand side. And people who have a stroke, they give up. After a while, they feel frustrated and say, I'm just going to accept my half paralyzed body, and I'll just use my right-hand side and continue to use the right-hand side and continue to ignore it. Because when you don't use your fingers, for example, when you move your fingers, you are activating, you're making that connection, you're reinforcing that connection. And so if you don't activate, you don't use your fingers, that will slowly reduce its intensity, and it will reduce its brain real estate. This is very interesting because it's the model of use it or lose it. If you're not using your function, something else will take over. For example, like especially older folks, when they walk, you see them looking down, right? Looking down. The reason they're looking down because they have lost their ability to sense the floor with their feet. And so they're using their eyes to convey the information, to see the ground that they're walking on. So in the book, one of the neurologists, Dr. Mazenik, when he was helping his mom to move about because his mom was weak, and his mom would look down to see where she was going to avoid a fall. But he told his mom, say, Mom, do not look down. Try to sense where you're going, to strengthen the senses, to reactivate the parts in the brain that senses the floor. So when we wear shoes a whole lot, we think that the floor is even. So the brain only knows an even level floor and doesn't recognize it. There are uneven surfaces, so it loses its ability to detect uneven surfaces to maintain balance. So we wear shoes a whole lot, it could lose its sensitivity, and therefore we have to use other senses to make up for it, to see where we're going, right? So seeing is not just the eye, but your feeling as well. When you step on the floor, you have this 3D map of the environment. It's like a blind person, right, using a cane to see. So seeing is not just the eyes, but other senses as well. So whenever that we don't use something, we don't continue to practice meditation, and we let it elapse, then we will lose. It's very difficult to pick up that momentum again. And so it helps to maintain that continuity. And so talking about change, if we want change, the best way is to continue every day to reinforce the self of that change, right? And then it becomes natural and more manageable. Otherwise, if we try to force change on ourselves, our whole self will fight back because it's not used to it. We are introducing something that's foreign to it, and therefore it will try to reject it or get rid of it. But if we introduce a little bit at a time, then it will become tolerant to it, and therefore it will be more acceptable. So we have to understand the psychology a little bit in order to navigate ourselves around it to achieve our goal, right? So understanding that whenever we do something, we form this network. And if we continue to do that, we are reinforcing that network. The signal becomes clearer and clearer, and it'll be more acceptable to the whole part of ourselves. And once it accepts it, then it's very easy to continue to grow. Just like any foreign object in our body, a virus of some sort, the body will try to reject it, eliminate it. But once it's used to it, then it accepts it. That's, and it has. So the same thing, our mind, our history, our memories will reject what is it that it doesn't like or it doesn't recognize. So if we introduce change little by little, eventually it'll recognize it and it'll become more tolerable. Right? So that's the first, with the dukkha, dissatisfaction, we want change. We recognize that there's something better, and we introduce change slowly, daily, in order to have effective transformation. So once we have in causal association with dukkha arises faith. Faith here is the belief that there is something more meaningful. That's the healthy counterpart of craving. It develops when, as a result of our experience of the painful, unsatisfactory, and frustrating nature of samsaric existence, and we begin to place the heart on the unconditioned. Right now, we know that the cycle of life and death, we get nothing out of it. And it doesn't, and so we want something that's more reliable. We want something more meaningful, more reliable, and that's faith. Is that we think, we believe through our experience. That's gotta be something more than this, right? So at first, we will have this hesitant and intermittent and this confusion whether to accept it or not. But as it grows stronger, it comes more clearly into focus, and it develops into called faith proper. Just like the mind rejects it because the network has not been formed, right? So speaking from the neurological perspective, so for us to accept something, it needs to have to grow and strengthen in order for us to accept it. Otherwise, it becomes intermittent. Sometimes we are faithful, sometimes we're not. And once we grow this strong faith, then we have this faith in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha because we believe in the value. We believe that those three Jews are valuable and they can help us. So we have this heartfelt acknowledgement that the Buddha, that Gautama is the Buddha or the enlightened one, based on first our intuition. We know deep in our heart, we know there's something better than life. Not just our selfish life, but we know that there's something wonderful about being altruistic, right? Being selfless, being helpful. There's something better than being selfish, right? So that's intuition. The second is sensible evidence and rational proofs of the Buddha's enlightenment from the sutras. We can read the sutras, how the sutra describes an arhat, free of afflictions, free of faults. And so he himself, if he describes such and such, then we could believe that he was holding himself up to the standard. But that's still not enough. We still need the experience, personal experience to appreciate it. Right? You can hear lectures all day long, read books, but then it means nothing if we cannot relate to it. And by relating to it, we are actually practicing it, right? Incorporating it in our lives. So we believe the Gautama is the enlightened one based on intuition, based on records, the sutras, and based on our personal experience. When we sit in meditation, we can feel the calm, like described in the sutra. And when we continue to do that, we start to feel insight. We start to feel freer from affliction, as described in the sutra. So we start to relate, maybe this is making sense. Maybe this is the truth here, right? So when the mind is purged of its feelings of guilt, repentance, and remorse, that is a very healthy mental attitude. So for a person to know that he or she has done nothing wrong is very powerful. That is why observing the precepts is very positive and very healthy. It's not to restrict us, but to transform us, to empower us. Is very healthy, right? Okay, let's go one more, and then we'll call it for the day, and we'll continue the next meeting. The third is that in causal associations with faith proper arises satisfaction and delight. So once you, in a sense, have faith, you feel at ease, knowing that there's something that you can rely on, right? It's very peaceful feeling, very safe feeling to know that there is something that now you have found a way to overcome your dissatisfaction, your suffering. It's a wonderful feeling, right? It's a very a feeling of safety, of spiritual safety. So this is equivalent to the possessions of an easy conscience, right? You have not done nothing wrong. You feel very easy, at ease. You can go wherever you want without being fear of being admonished, being fear of being criticized, because you have not done anything wrong, right? So as opposed to trying to hide yourself, trying to weasel your way about because of fear of criticism, because you have done something bad, right, and skillful. So positively, it is the feeling of cheerfulness and content, the awareness that he is following the path of virtue, right, doing nothing wrong, right. The mind that is disturbed by the recollections of a breach of moral precept is incapable of concentration, so that the way to further progress is barred. That's why when you sit in meditation, in order to be successful in meditation, you really have to purge all the negative feelings. That's why we practice visualizations of compassion to bring out the positivity in us. You cannot be at ease, feeling happy, if there are grudges in your head, in your heart, right? There's still hatred in your heart. Meditation masters such as Juzi of the Tentai school recommend that before embarking on the practice of meditation, that we go through like confession, repentance, ritual worships of the Buddha, recitations of sutras for a period of time. Could be a few days, weeks, months, until the mind is freed from the burden of guilt and again feels fresh and clear and light. And so it's very important. So when we participate in Dharma assembly and we sing, we repent, at the end we feel refreshed. We feel like the burden has been lifted from our shoulders. And we feel very refreshed. And when we sit in meditation with a clear conscience, we can make progress. Okay. So as this develops and grows stronger in causal association with content, delight, it arises pity. So this is like the next level of joy. It goes deeper. So pity here is translated as interest, enthusiasm, joy, rapture, ecstasy. Very coarse joy that you can feel with your body, your physical body. And that marks the transitions from the Kamaloka to the Rupaloka. So now we are really making, serious transition. And this requires meditation. You cannot have pity without meditation. You cannot have this joy, this rapture, this kind of rapture without meditation. So you're transitioning from the realm of desire to the realm of form, which is a meditative environment. So this requires a higher level of consciousness. And the only way that we can purify the consciousness, raise the level of consciousness, is through meditation, right? So let's just finish up and then we'll wrap this up. So pity represents the much greater sense of relief, result of the liberations of the emotional energies locked up in the deep-seated conflicts of the unconscious mind. So through our meditation, or through repentance, through lifting all the baggage, the emotional baggage that we have in our mind, and through repentance, we now have clear conscience of ourselves, then we are feeling relief. Right? Relief. And the greater quantities of energies are released, the more transporting it becomes. So it can become, our body, every pores of our body will feel happiness, will have joy, will feel with joy, to a point that it can be very levitating. We can actually be physically lifted off the ground. So there's a story that I do want to share with you. But let's stop here and we'll continue that next time. All right? Any comments, questions? Okay, so before, just quickly review here that from afflictions to nirvana, the main source of affliction is our consciousness, which is our sense consciousness. When we interact with the world and we have a delusion, then it will lead to affliction, because of our wrong perception. But with our awareness, we will march towards transcendental awareness. So when we practice Buddhism, it doesn't mean that we isolate ourselves and we don't interact with the world for fear of affliction. No, we just need to add that factor of awareness, and then we can transform afflictions into nirvanic state, right? So the point here is how to maintain awareness and to avoid ourselves from causing rise to affliction because of delusion, because of unawareness, right? And the path to awareness is a positive state, not necessarily a negative one. On the negative side, we eliminate all greed, anger, delusion. On the positive side, we cultivate compassion, we cultivate wisdom, right? And you can see that it goes from first recognizing the dissatisfaction of this world. That helps us to make a determination, yes, I need to do something about it. And it leads to faith, knowing that there's something we can rely on, the preciousness of the three jewels. Give us a sense of relief. And then it leads to, that's faith. And then faith leads to content with the clear conscience. And knowing that we have done nothing wrong is very powerful. And that leads to greater joy, which is pity, right? So, and then we go on the next. So there are 7 more. We've reached 4 levels already, steps, if you will. Not really step by step, but 4 levels. So there are 12. So we have a few more to go to discuss. Okay? All right, let's do merit dedication. Please join your palms together. We recite. May the merits and virtues accrue today, adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss.